Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in Russia, and specifically to talk about a statement that was made recently by economists that Russia can't afford to lose the war in Ukraine, nor can it afford to win it. Now, you might be thinking that's a ludicrous statement. Of course, when you start a war, your objective is to win that war, and that's what Russia looks like it wants to do. It's occupied large areas of Ukraine, it's claiming that those areas are now part of an enlarged Russia, and it wants a new boundary to be set. That's its objective. But the issue here is that Russia has actually become dependent on the war. It's changed its whole economy. It's become a wartime economy, and that's actually driving up GDP. And if we look at the figures for 2023, Russia actually achieved GDP growth of 3.6%, which was significantly more than Germany achieved at 3%, than the 2.5% achieved in the USA, Japan at 1.9%, and the UK only achieved 0.1%. So at face value, Russia looks like it's doing considerably better than the countries from the West that are applying sanctions against it. And I've had thousands of comments in the section below from people who support Russia saying exactly that Russia is now doing really well and the war hasn't affected it at all. However, when you look into the details as to how Russia has achieved that growth in GDP, it isn't because it's been doing what it's been doing for the last 20 years better than it was historically. It's actually because the Kremlin is now pumping billions of dollars into the wartime effort, and that's actually providing a real bonus for GDP. And if the war was to stop tomorrow, then all of that money would cease overnight and potentially the economy of Russia would fall into recession. So in today's video, we'll have a look at the wartime economy. We'll talk about what Russia has been doing to actually drive up its GDP. We'll then have a look at some of the fundamentals in the Russian economy. So we'll have a look at what's been happening with the workforce, the population, inflation, interest rates, all of those sort of things that tell us exactly why GDP is growing right now. We'll then have a look at the cost of Russia losing this war, what would actually be involved if it did concede defeat. We'll also have a look at what the potential costs are of Russia winning this war. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications of a loss or a win for Russia would be, and what the likelihood is of the war ending at some point over the course of the next 6 months. But before we get started on all of that, I've got some really exciting news for you. I've decided to give away another one of my sculptures, and it's this piece, which is called Windswept Clock, because it's actually got a fully functioning clock built into it, and it's by a British artist called Paul Margetts, who I've got a lot of different pieces from, and I think this is absolutely fantastic. It's really heavy. This would look amazing in anybody's place, and you can win this by entering into the prize draw, and the tickets are priced at only £1 each, which is around $1.30. So if you want to support the channel, rather than buying me a coffee or sending me a YouTube super thanks, why don't you buy a ticket and you could win this thing, and you can follow on from the previous winners like Craig in Australia, who won the little red balloon dog, and Lars from the Netherlands, who won Stiltman. And there is a potential, if you do win, that you may have to pay some import duty. I don't think Craig or Lars did, so maybe you won't. And I'm getting an independent company to organise everything for me, so it's all above board. I won't be involved in drawing the winner. That's entirely at random. But if you'd like to win this, an original Joe Blog sculpture, you can't buy these things, you can only win them, then have a look at the details below and buy a ticket, and good luck. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Incogni. One of the things that drives me absolutely mad is unsolicited marketing, whether it be spam emails, spam texts, or my personal pet peeve, spam phone calls. People constantly ringing me up, asking me if I want to move my mobile phone provider and things like that. And the reason that you get so much of this these days is because data brokers pick up your data when you go online or when you sign up for a store card or something like that, and those data brokers can sell that data into hundreds of different databases. Now, the good news is that if you find out which databases you're on, you can contact them and ask to be removed. But who's got time to do that? And the fantastic news is that Incogni can do all of this for you. once you sign up with them, they will contact the data brokers and ask for your data to be removed. And as well as stopping all of those annoying unsolicited marketing calls and contact emails, it will also protect you from cybercrime and identity theft. And the great news is that Joe Blogs viewers can get a 60% discount on an annual membership by clicking in the link below. This chart shows the annual percentage movement in GDP in Russia dating back to 2014. And the scale on the right-hand side of this chart goes from -4% at the bottom to +7% at the top. And what this shows is that in 2014, Russia achieved GDP growth of 0.7%. And 2014 was the year that Russia invaded and annexed Crimea, which was formerly part of Ukraine. And as a result of that, sanctions were applied against Russia, but nowhere near to the extent that they've been applied following the full invasion of Ukraine that started in 2022. And as a result of those sanctions, GDP actually fell in 2015 by 2%, and GDP growth in 2016 was only 0.3%. And you can see that it took another couple of years to 2018 before Russia started to see some serious growth in GDP when it increased by 2.8%. Now in 2019 there was a slowdown in the global economy and GDP growth fell back to 2.2%. 2020 was affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia saw a fall in GDP of 2.7%. However, in 2021 there was a bounce back and GDP rose by 5.9%. Now, as I'm sure you'll be aware, Russia commenced the invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022 and was hit by a massive amount of sanctions from the West. And as a result of that, GDP fell by 1.2% in 2022. However, as I mentioned at the start of today's video, in 2023, GDP was up by 3.6%. And this was one of the strongest growth rates seen in the world in 2023. However, one thing to bear in mind when you're looking at percentage growth is that it measures this year's growth against the figures from last year. And as you can see here, in 2022, GDP fell by 1.2%. So the 3.6% growth is being measured against that fall in GDP that was experienced in 2022. And just as a quick comparison, I thought it was worth having a look at what happened in the United States over the same period. And you can see that in 2014, the USA achieved GDP growth of 2.5%. In 2015, growth was 2.9%. It was 1.8% in 2016, 2.5% 2017, 3% 2018, dropped down to 2.5% in 2019 as a result of that global slowdown, fell by 2.2% in 2020 as a result of the COVID pandemic. Growth bounced back to 5.8% in 2021, hit 1.9% in 2022, and in 2023, GDP grew by 2.5%. And the reason I wanted to have a look at this is just to show that in the last 10 years, the USA has seen growth in GDP in every single one apart from 2020. And of course, the cumulative impact of that is that you've got year-on-year growth. If we quickly jump back to the Russian figures, you can see that in 2015, 2020, and 2022, GDP actually fell. So even though you've got growth in all of the other years, the cumulative effect is reduced. So if you think about it in very simple terminology, over the past 10 years, the USA has taken 9 steps forward and 1 step back, whereas Russia has taken 7 steps forward and 3 steps back. And that really gives you a flavour as to where the economies are sitting. Now, in terms of the outlook for GDP for 2024, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which does a lot of research on all of the economies of the world, recently upgraded the prospects for Russia and says that it now expects Russia to achieve 3.2% growth in the whole of this year. And that's actually significantly more than a lot of other developed economies. So the USA forecast is 2.7%, Japan is forecast to achieve 0.9%, the UK 0.5%, and Germany 0.2%. And once again, a lot of people take this as proof that the Russian economy is doing really well. Well, the first thing that you need to take into account is what we've just discussed. The fact that over the past 10 years, the Russian economy hasn't been growing consistently. It's actually experienced a fall in GDP in 3 years. So even though it's expected to grow strongly in 2024, it's coming from a lower base compared to a lot of those other economies. But also what we need to take into account is the fact that Russia has changed the way it's growing its GDP. It's moved to being a wartime economy. And what that means is that a lot of companies in Russia have actually been commandeered to join in the war effort. So the Russian authorities want to make sure that they have enough equipment and materials and weapons to keep the war going. So many companies that were not involved in anything to do with the military prior to the invasion have now been told that they need to start producing things. And the benefit that those companies have is that the Kremlin is paying them. So they've got guaranteed orders, guaranteed payments. They don't have to do any marketing. They don't have to do any product development. All the things that would normally be involved in growing a business. You don't have to do that. You can put your existing business to one side and focus in on producing things for the state. So that's great in terms of the short-term gain. You've got a boost in your revenue and your profits. And so that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this huge increase in GDP, because a lot of companies that previously had lost trade as a result of the sanctions, they no longer could export to the markets in the West. They're now getting all of this guaranteed business. So this is providing a real boost for a lot of those businesses. And the other thing that the Russian authorities are doing is pumping lots of money into public administration, lots of government departments, all the people that are needed to keep the war effort going. They're boosting all of that. And this is driving up wages in Russia because there's now a manpower shortage. And we'll come on to talk about what's happened with regards to people leaving the country and the population in a moment. But because there is now a shortage of people, companies are having to increase the amount that they're paying. That's driving up wages. And that increase in wages means that people have more money to spend. They're paying more in taxes. And all of this is generating more money for the state. So this seems like a perfect virtuous circle. The Kremlin pumps more money into the economy. People earn more money. They spend more money. And so it goes on. So this seems like a great arrangement. But as I mentioned right at the start of this video, this isn't something that you can do over the long term, because this is a short-term gain for long-term pain, because the Kremlin is having to fund all of this. They're having to use their reserves to basically pay all of these companies and all of these people. So it can't go on indefinitely. And this is one of the things that I want to talk about at the end of today's video, that if the war in Ukraine was to stop tomorrow, then obviously this boost to GDP would also stop. The economy would slow down. And these companies might find that they're in a precarious position because they've lost all of their real customers. They've been focusing in on producing things for the war. And once the war stops, all of that business stops. And these businesses could be at risk of going bust. Now, as we've discussed previously, one of the major implications in Russia of the invasion of Ukraine was that it was estimated that around 500,000 people fled the country. They either didn't agree with the politics of invading their neighbour, or they didn't want to run the risk of being called up and forced to go and fight in Ukraine. And as a result of the mobilisation effort, whereby President Putin said that another 300,000 men were needed to go and fight in Ukraine, it was estimated that a further 700,000 people left Russia. So in total, during 2022, 1.2 million people left Russia permanently. And those 1.2 million were part of the workforce. So that reduced the amount of people that Russia had to do things, to produce things, and to produce GDP. So that was one of the reasons why GDP fell during 2022. And this chart, which is the population pyramid for Russia, which you'll be familiar with if you follow the channel because we've looked at it on a number of occasions, is one of the other reasons why the Russian economy is under pressure right now. Because over the past 30 years, there has been a fall in the birth rate and a rise in the death rate. So basically, Russia is losing people. It's got a declining population. And you can see from this population pyramid that there is a narrowing towards the bottom. There are less people in the age groups between 0 and 30 than there are in the older age groups. And this represents another problem from Russia's point of view because they have an aging population. They don't have enough young people coming through into the workforce to keep expanding GDP. And that also represents a problem because the retirement age of women in Russia is 58, which is one of the lowest out of all of the countries in the G20. That's 7 years lower than it is in Canada, 8 years lower than it is in the United Kingdom and Germany, and 9 years lower than the United States and Australia. And when you think of 7, 8 or 9 years additional work across tens of millions of people. That is a lot of productivity that Russia is losing as a result of that retirement age. And it's not just the women that have a lower retirement age in Russia. The official retirement age for men is 63, which is 2 years less than Canada, 3 years less than the United Kingdom, and 4 years less than the United States and Australia. And once again, if you think about the number of man hours involved in 2 or 3 or 4 years, multiplied by tens of millions of people, that is a huge amount of productivity that Russia simply doesn't have. As we discussed earlier in the video, Russia achieved better GDP growth in 2023 than the USA, Japan, Germany, the UK, and most countries from the West. And that GDP growth is forecast to continue into 2024. So when you look at those figures, you might expect that the Russian economy is doing really well and things like inflation and interest rates will be completely under control. But that isn't the situation at all. This chart shows the annual movement in the official rate of inflation in Russia over the past 12 months. And what this shows is that this time last year, inflation was running at 3.3%, which was actually below the target level of 4% set by the Russian central bank. So at that point in time, everything looked completely in control. However, as you can see, over the past 12 months, the official rate of inflation has increased rapidly and consistently, and the official figure for May 24 was 8.3%, which is more than double the target rate of 4%. And the reason for this rapid increase in inflation is what we've just discussed. There is a shortage of workforce in Russia right now, and the fact that the Kremlin is paying companies to produce things for the war effort in Ukraine means that those companies are able to offer higher wages to attract in more staff because they've got guaranteed sales. They don't have to worry about marketing all of their products and the impact of exchange rates and all of those sort of factors. They know that they're getting paid directly from the state, and therefore they're happy to go out and hire more people. There is no risk involved from their perspective. And the problem that that's causing in the Russian economy is that it's driving up wages because the companies that are losing those people are then having to recruit replacement staff. And of course, they have to compete in terms of where wages are. So wages are now spiraling in Russia. They're going up. That increase in wages means that all of the people have more money. They're spending more money in their local economy. That's driving up demand. And when demand goes up, it pushes up prices. And that's what's fueling this rapid increase in inflation. And if we have a look at this chart, which shows the official interest rate in Russia over the past 3 years, and focus in on what's been happening over the past 12 months, this time last year, the official rate of interest was 7.5%, which is actually quite a high rate in itself. However, over the past 12 months, as a result of that rapid increase in inflation, the Russian central bank has increased interest rates on multiple occasions, and the official rate of interest today is sitting at 16%. And if we compare that with the other countries in the G20, you can see that there are only 2 countries that have a higher rate of interest than Russia: Turkey, where it's 50%, and Turkey is in a state of economic crisis right now, and Argentina, where it's 40%, and inflation in Argentina is currently sitting at almost 300%. So that is off the scale. And the only other countries that have interest rates in double digits are Mexico and Brazil. And if you look at the countries from the West that we've been talking about, interest rates are sitting at or around 5%. So 16% is around 3 times higher than all of those comparable countries. And this tells us that things are not going well in the Russian economy right now. GDP may be growing, and that's one metric that you can look at to see how well a country is performing. But you have to always look under the bonnet. Look at the details as to how that GDP has been achieved. And the inflation and interest rate figures tell us that there are serious problems in Russia right now. As I mentioned at the start of today's video, economists are saying that Russia simply can't afford to lose the war in Ukraine, because if they did lose, if they conceded defeat and said, we're really sorry, we shouldn't have invaded Ukraine, we'll make good all of the damage that we've caused, it would cost Russia more than $500 billion to cover all of those costs. Now, obviously, this is a theoretical discussion because it's very unlikely that President Putin is going to say, I've made a mistake here, I've decided I'm going to withdraw, I'm really sorry, let me know how much I owe. I don't think that's realistically going to happen. But let's have a look at the potential implications if that was to occur. This chart, which was produced by the World Bank in a recent report forecasting the rebuild cost of all of the damage caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine to December 2023, shows us a breakdown of all of the areas that have been affected. The biggest single expense will be the cost of replacing all of the housing that's either been damaged or completely destroyed as a result of the bombing and invasion, and it's estimated that that would cost $80 billion. The second biggest cost, at $74 billion, would be replacing all of the damaged transport infrastructure, which includes all of the roads and railways and other infrastructure that's been damaged. The third biggest cost, at around $68 billion, is repairing the damage that's been inflicted to commerce and industry as a result of either the buildings being bombed or those businesses having to close. The fourth biggest cost, at $56 billion, is repairing all of the damage to agriculture, and that includes removing all of the explosives and mines and shrapnel that are on that land, as well as repairing those businesses. Repairing the damage to the energy and mining industries is forecast currently to be $47 billion. The cost of repairing social livelihoods and enterprises is forecast to be around $45 billion. And removing explosive devices and mines from the rest of the land was forecast to be $35 billion. And the total estimate provided by the World Bank was $486 billion. Now, obviously, the World Bank figures only cover the period through to December 2023. So if we take an average of around $12 billion per month, the 6 months in 2024 that were not included would add a further $75 billion to that bill. And as we continue through 2024, we'll be adding more and more cost. And this is the reason why economists have said that Russia can't afford to lose the war, because they would have to fund the bill for all of this. So they would have to hand over somewhere in the region of $550 billion if the war was to stop tomorrow to cover all of those rebuild costs. But as I said earlier, I don't think that's very likely. I don't think President Putin is going to agree to hand over that amount of cash. So losing the war in Ukraine, whilst it might be unlikely, isn't a realistic option from Russia from an economic point of view. So as I said at the start of this video, economists have said that Russia can't actually afford to win this war. If the war was to stop tomorrow, that would have a major negative impact on the Russian economy. And there are two reasons for that. The first is that they would have to cover all of the rebuild costs of all of the areas that they have now occupied. If Ukraine signs a peace treaty and says Russia can keep all of those occupied areas, obviously Russia doesn't want to sit owning a lot of land that is completely devastated, that has been bombed to death over the course of the last 2 years. So in order to make all of those areas economically viable again and worthwhile from Russia's point of view, they would have to fund all of the rebuild costs themselves. Now, the figures that we've just looked at from the World Bank include the whole of Ukraine. So there will be some damage to areas outside of the occupied zones. But if we assume that at least 2/3 of that damage has been inflicted in the areas that are occupied by Ukraine, then out of that $550 billion, Russia would need to cover somewhere in the region of $400 billion to make good all of the damage that it's caused. And that's obviously going to put a lot of pressure on the Kremlin. We've been talking about Russia's reserves a lot over the course of the last 18 months or so. And at the time of the invasion, Russia was estimated to have total reserves of around $600 billion. Now, $300 billion of that has been frozen by the companies where the cash is sitting, but the other $300 billion is in the Kremlin. And if Russia only has reserves of $300 billion, it's going to struggle to pay $400 billion for all of those damages. But over and above the cost of actually repairing all of the damage, there would also be a massive impact in terms of Russia ceasing the wartime economy. If the war in Ukraine stops tomorrow, then the Kremlin will no longer need to fund all of the businesses to produce things for the war effort. And so all of those companies will lose all of that guaranteed income, and they will then be left to fend for themselves. They'll have to go back to doing what they were doing before the war started. And this could cause major problems for those companies, because if they haven't been keeping up all of their other businesses, if they haven't been continuing to market their products and export them and sell them to all of their customers, then it's likely that their customers will have gone elsewhere. They'll have sourced from somewhere else. And so those businesses may find that they're in a state of complete chaos. They lose their guaranteed funding and they don't have any other revenue coming in. And this could cause one of the biggest recessions ever to occur in Russia. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because there's been a lot of discussion as to what's happening in the Russian economy. And I'm constantly bombarded with messages from people saying Russia is actually doing much better now than it was before the war started. This war has been good news for Russia and it will come out stronger than all of the countries from the West. The West is actually shooting itself in the foot by imposing all of these sanctions because they're having to pay more for things like oil and natural gas. And when you look at the GDP figures at face value, it would be easy to be lulled into a false sense of security that Russia is doing well, because when you compare the percentage growth figures, Russia is actually coming out better. However, you always need to look into the detail. And as we discussed earlier in the video, one of the things that you need to take into account is what's been happening with GDP over a 10-year period. If you have consistent year-on-year growth like we've seen in the USA, then your GDP figure is always going up. However, that hasn't been the situation in Russia. In 3 out of the last 10 years, GDP has actually fallen. So you haven't got consistent growth. You've got GDP going up and down. So a figure of 3.6% for 2023 looks great at face value, but you need to take into account that GDP actually fell in 2022. So Russia is coming from a lower base when it's calculating that percentage growth figure. But the other factor that you also need to look into is what's happening in the economy. Why is GDP growing so rapidly? And what we've seen from today's video is that the reason for the growth in Russia isn't because it's exporting more oil and natural gas and all of the things that it was doing prior to the invasion of Ukraine. It isn't just building on its long-term strengths, but rather what's happened is that the Kremlin has changed the focus of the economy. It's now become a wartime economy. A lot of people are now employed in industries where they're helping keep the war going. And this is all being funded by the state. So this is great in terms of growing that GDP rapidly. But there are 2 implications here. Firstly, the companies involved are now dependent on that cash coming from the Kremlin rather than making sales to the rest of the world. So that isn't a good long-term strategy. And secondly, the increase in wages as a result of this change in strategy is driving up inflation and interest rates, which are causing major problems for the long-term future of the Russian economy. The last thing that any central bank wants is for inflation to get out of control, because that causes major problems. We've seen that in economies such as Turkey and Argentina. But unfortunately, from Russia's point of view, that's exactly what's happening in their economy right now. And the longer that this wartime economy goes on for, the worse the problems will get, because those companies will become more dependent on that state funding. Wages are likely to be driven up even further as more people are pulled into the state system. And so this will cause serious issues as soon as the war stops. And as we also looked at in today's video, there are fundamental problems in Russia right now, partly as a result of the loss of 1.2 million people at the start of the war, and also due to the demographic issues. They've got a falling birth rate and a rising death rate. And all of this is adding up to some serious issues that Russia is going to have to deal with. So the overall summary of today's video is that the statement that I made about Russia not being able to afford to lose the war or win the war actually has a lot of credibility, because if Russia was to lose the war, obviously there would be an enormous cost in terms of having to pay for all of the repairs of the damage that's been caused. But in terms of winning the war, there is actually a bigger cost, because if the war ended tomorrow, then that wartime economy would cease, and that would throw a lot of companies into chaos and potentially could lead to a huge fall in GDP. And in addition to that, Russia will also have to fund the repair bills in all of the areas of Ukraine that it's occupying. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.